Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me here. I'm Phil Rice. This is the Phil Rice channel, YouTube, Substack, and the rest. And once again, I have a very cool guest to bring forward, someone new to this channel, and really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. We're going to sort of wander around a little bit as well. It's quite a broad sort of umbrella, the topic that I put on the thumbnail, but we're going to be exploring some topics that are, in my view, are a lot of fun to discuss. And this guest is very knowledgeable. And so I would just like to say welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. At some point, we're towards probably the end of the first hour. We'll run through some audience questions. So please enter your questions into the live chat and we will get to those. And also, please hit that subscribe button to stay notified for new videos. And obviously, there's lots of ways you can follow the stuff that I make. I've got several social medias that I upload to and maintain, and I'm on Telegram for those who like to get updates, and I have extra goodies that come up on Telegram for those that wander off the mainstream platforms. I also have a wonderful Substack where you can get the same content without ads. And it's also a much better platform for creators like myself. So I appreciate those of you that have gone to Substack. And of course, TikTok. And then I've got my email there if anyone wants to contact me for queries and also about my services that I offer. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you for watching. And I'm going to bring on the guest. But first of all, I'm going to just read a little bio for the guest that I have today. So Steve Seven is a psychologist, mystic, and founding editor of Spiritual Instinct Press. His writing sits at the intersection of depth psychology and spiritual experience, connecting the latest research in neurology and the social sciences with ancient Hermetic wisdom. Steve's an old mate of mine, and I've been looking forward to getting him on here. He's a very prolific writer, and his books are really, really dense and just a real pleasure to read. So for those of you that really like to nerd out on on detail and things like this, I thoroughly recommend Steve. But anyway, rather than talk about him, let's just bring the man on himself. Greetings, Steve. Wonderful to have you here, sir.
Hello, Phil. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
And always a pleasure to connect with you, and great to have you on the channel. And I really appreciate, we're obviously, you're in a European time zone, so, trying to catch people at times at work on weekends and things. I'm really grateful that you're able to sort of make some time. You're a very busy man. You're very down to earth with your living style. And and I love the posts that you put up. You've got a great YouTube channel where you share, how you're sort of, we're talking about pretty dense topics here, but you're also like I said, you're down to earth. You've got your hands in the earth, and you're building and you're teaching and things too. So, but would you like to give us just what's been happening, man? You're running a publishing business as well, and writing books and things. So could you give us a bit of an update on what's been going on?
Okay. Well, I mean, the last time we spoke, I think I was living in Germany. I come from New Zealand. In fact, I was born in Auckland, which is where Phil lives at the moment. So we're sort of fellow New Zealanders. In 2008, I went to Germany. I lived there for about 13 years. I was still in Germany last time we spoke, and I'd already begun writing mainly on spiritual alchemy, but I had just started at that point writing about the historical Jesus, because they actually overlap quite a bit. Then in 2022, I went to Spain for 16 months with my family. And we actually thought we were going to stay there, develop a alternative lifestyle, get back to the land, if you like, and we just found that with the heat, with the bureaucracy, with the lack of water, it was too hard. You know, you have to have a situation with mega amounts of money to be able to do it, you know, in Spain because of the climate effectively, and also because of the bureaucracy, which water is their control mechanism in Spain.
All right.
I mean, I lived for 13 years in Germany, and coming from New Zealand, which, as you know, is very an easy country to live in for bureaucracy, not very hard at all. I was pretty shocked about Germany, but I expected it. It was no surprises really, but it was pretty bad, you know. When I went to Spain, I couldn't believe it. The bureaucracy in Spain is infinitely worse than Germany. It makes Germany look incredibly easy going, and all of the 2030 Great Reset stuff that we've talked about in the past is pretty much already established in Spain. Spain was a very easy place for them to get everyone to just live full time in their apartment block and don't go outside, and you know what I mean. It's like the control in Spain is it's really quite funny because the social engineering, the socialization of the Spanish people is incredibly different from Central and Western Northern Europe. In Spain, it's a tourist destination, and the people are very hospitable, very friendly, incredibly different. And that is a real big plus. But unfortunately, hand in hand with that same socialization of hospitality is a passivity. They are very passive people. They will, you know, do whatever they're told, and the establishment has just got away with becoming a real iron fist, which I was not at all expecting. So to cut a long story a bit shorter, we ended up in March last year, I think it was. So yeah, it's the end of this year. Yeah, so about 18 months ago, a little bit more, we ended up in Bulgaria, which is an incredibly good place, you know, especially as far as bureaucracy goes. There are so many really positive aspects of Bulgaria that most people wouldn't like, and can be a little bit sort of like, you know, the cloud and the silver lining. I'll give you one example. People are a bit afraid about a cashless society with good reason. Okay. And I would be very wary of that myself. And in Bulgaria, it's impossible to post a book at any post shop without paying cash. They don't take cards. You know what I mean? It is actually, it can be a bit of a hassle for us sometimes because the village we live in doesn't have a money machine to get cash out, right? We have to go to a town. Yeah. So, you know, when we run out of cash, we have to drive or catch a bus or whatever for 15Ks to get the cash out. So that's sort of, you know, the good and the bad of it. But at least we know that, you know, and there's in Bulgaria, there's a very healthy skepticism of authority here, which of course Bulgaria was also behind the Iron Curtain in the days of the Soviet Union, you know, and so they know all about dictatorships here. And the history of Bulgaria is actually quite colorful, and it has made a colorful mixture of people here. There's a real mixture of people. And the reason why I thought that I would sort of, you know, apart from that you've asked me, I'll give you a little bit of background into, you know, my lifestyle. I mean, we live on an acre of land. We've got an old house. We've got a well, which is really, you know, in fact, the lady came to read the town supply water yesterday. And I don't know how often she comes, I think every 2 or 3 months. And we used 0 meters of water through the town supply because we use the well for everything, which means that if the town supply ends, and in this particular village, a lot of the people go for several hours every single day without water. We have it occasionally, it's occasionally for us, but we sort of in the worst part for the town supply, but we've got a well, so we have no problems with water. And all of these things, you know, we've got a huge garden. This year we've got 80 pumpkins. We've gone from having, yeah, big ones. Some of them are real big, you know. We've gone from having 4 chickens at the end of last year. Now we've got 9 chickens, and next year at this time we expect we'll probably have about 25, 30 chickens. So we're slowly moving up. We've planted, I don't know, 16 apple trees already. There were some already here. You know, we've got, out of the acre that we own, we've probably used this year gone, I don't know, maybe 800 or 900 square meters for a garden, and next year we're hoping to do maybe 1,500 square meters for a garden. And the reason that I'm, you know, sort of explaining some of these details is because this is spiritual alchemy. You know, I've always said that spiritual alchemy is not some pie in the sky philosophical ideal or something like that. Spiritual alchemy is bringing your spiritual belief into your life, and having a garden, being self-sufficient, stepping out of the dominant culture is probably the single easiest way to explain the whole idea, as far as a spiritual alchemist goes, of the walk with a capital W, you know, the spiritual walk, finding your soul. So
I think no, that's wonderfully put. And I think too that, you know, a lot of people who are getting into some form of practice realize the impact of their environmental situation, and also, you know, the unnecessary busyness and the hooks that they've got in them from the, you know, the control system and things like this. Unnecessarily, it's holding them back from progress in certain ways. But they're not so aware of it because, you know, they're in the soup so much. And, you know, I mean, it started for me in one sense. I could say I started reading labels on the food, and that changed my direction and cleaned up my internal, because, you know, food choices can affect, you know, your meditation practice through the physiological noise that some foods will create. If you're trying to get into a meditative state for whatever purpose, and the food is creating all this noise and you can't focus, I mean, what are you eating? What's going on in the environment? You know, there's a lot of, you know, what's the quality of your water? Are you in the middle of like lots of cell phone towers and you struggle to concentrate? You know, and also having your own supply of food. There's a level of unconscious confidence that comes when you are, I mean, you know, I make pretty much all my own food from scratch. And even that process, my approach to how I prepare and eat my food, and I'm just, you know, infusing as many layers in my life as I can. I do the best with what I can, with what I have available to me. But you know, the lifestyle that you live and how you live and your relationship to the land and all these types of things is going to dramatically impact, you know, your personal progress. And so it's good to pay attention to it, you know. And you know, you're living in a very different place with a very different approach to life. And I'm sure, you know, you're an adventurer in my view, and I love so much, you know, you're traveling countries. And I've heard people who've talked about Spain and gone there, and now they're looking to move out because what you said, people are talking about Southeast Asia because there's some real progress going on there. They've got their own quirks and things and that too. But I think, you know, for the long game, considering your immediate, you know, geographical location is a worthwhile consideration. And in New Zealand, it's not too bad. It's pretty relaxed here, kind of. But you can slowly, you know, it's becoming a little more obvious that there's, you know, we have massive population condensing going on. We also have we have an export of migrants, New Zealanders leaving as well. Like, it's quite significant, but we have a large influx coming in. And so we are slowly having a population swap out. And that impacts overall the ability to do practice and to lead you know, an ideal, whatever that might be, practice, a lifestyle. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because, you know, I get great joy. It actually brings me a great peace, you know, to, you know, when we've got the garden growing and I go out there and I can pull some spinach off. There's a peacefulness and a very special relationship that forms, you know. So thank you for bringing that up. But
yeah, not at all.
But I tell you what, brother, like this heading I chose for the thumbnail, which I may modify because the conversation will probably morph into some other topics. But what I wanted to ask you, Steve, from your experience and where you sit presently, what is your how would you describe, explain, articulate this heading of spiritual alchemy to just I'll just leave that one with you, brother. Like I'll let you explain.
Okay, well, I think most people have some sort of an understanding of alchemy being old men sitting around cauldrons and mixing ingredients to try and turn lead into gold and having, sort of a life, you know what I mean, sort of in that kind of, it did actually play a part. I mean, people did do that. People did actually experiment with different methods of metallurgy to try and change base metals. The kind of material or rational underpinning of that is that the whole universe is in a flux. It's not constant. Okay. And it changes anyway. We're watching it with evolution and things like that, erosion, a crystal growing, things like this. We're watching a tree growing. We're watching alchemy. We're watching change and growth, things coming from one to another. Spiritual alchemy is taking the symbols of material alchemy, like the lead and the gold and the cauldron and the philosopher's stone, and the smelting process, taking those as symbols for spiritual development. In other words, the lead is the shipwrecked soul, a person with a shipwrecked soul, if you like, who decides that they are going to go through personal transformation towards more enlightenment in their life, more spiritual development, more self-realization in their life, which is the gold. Okay. And the philosopher's stone is in fact self-realization, the self being two aspects. First of all, the aspect that we are all divine sparks, or we're sparks from the great divine flame. That's the first part of the self-awareness. The second part deals with the way that we have been influenced by our environment, damaged by our environment as we grew up and made our way into the world. When we were dependent as children and babies and children on the world, we, were influenced, programmed, if you like, formed, shaped by the world, into what the world wanted us to be. And of course, damaged everyone. It's impossible to not be damaged when you, for the first, 2 or 3 years of your life, you cannot really articulate your needs. You're completely and utterly dependent on your environment. When you cry, your mother doesn't necessarily know whether your nappy needs changing or you're hungry or you're cold or whatever. And, we can suffer a lot of different stress from that. And that's even if we have the best intentioned parents. And then you add on to that the times when people might not have very good parents and they're actually subjected to deliberate actual abuse, okay, which a lot of people are. And so spiritual alchemy is all about going through the cauldron of our life's trials. In other words, the influences that have created our thinking in our life are driving us in a particular direction, which may or may not be positive for us. They might not be helping us. It might not be necessarily so healthy. And if it's not healthy, we will inevitably end up with trials in our lives. We might attract bad relationships over and over again and wonder what's going on here. Why is that? And of course, generally speaking, most people will always blame the outside. They'll always blame the other person. And in spiritual alchemy, we look at ourselves and we think, what have I done to create this situation, this suffering? Not saying that all of our sufferings are something that we have created, because that can easily be and is often very easily manipulated into victim blaming. But generally speaking, as we go through our life and we end up in a bad situation with someone, or financially, or we're not happy in our job, or anything like that, you know what I mean? We need to say, what did I do to create this? Why did that happen? And what can I do to fix it? And inevitably it comes back to, I've got to get to my authentic self. I've got to stop following the dictates of my culture that have been literally programmed into me as I was young, right? I've got to find out who I am. So this is the second part of the self. I've got to find that I've got to find that divine spark, right? So there's sort of self-awareness in learning what is not authentic about yourself, that is taking you off your best course, what for your soul. Okay, I don't like the word destiny necessarily, but we could say that our soul has a particular future for us that it wants us to achieve, a certain goal perhaps, or a certain I can't think of the English word, but Aufgabe, like a role in our life. For me, it's being a writer is at the moment what my soul has driven me to do, and to go back to nature and have a garden and things like that. And there will be many people in the world who are sitting in an office 9 to 5, working for a boss and making him rich and earning a subsistence income, and living in a high-rise building with no backyard and watching TV every night, working all day, and then thinking they have some free time on the weekend when they go and play golf. You know what I mean? And it's like eventually those people are going to get hit with the idea, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And that's what spiritual alchemy is. Spiritual alchemy is saying, right, I'm going, there's various levels of what sort of suffering and trials that we go through, and that's the fire of the cauldron. Okay, so we're becoming purified through that fire, through that suffering, whether it be a bad relationship, which we all choose who we're going to have a relationship with, either as a friend or a romantic partner. We don't choose our parents, and that's also another big part of and our siblings, right? Our family, we don't choose those, and very often people are damaged by maladjusted families, and so sometimes in spiritual alchemy it might mean that we need to make decisions about how much we want to be involved with our family if it only leads to conflict, and we cannot if the expectations of our family, of course, are a very big part of social engineering, and a very big part of trying to condition us or program us to their expectations of what we should be. And the society we're living in, I'll tell you, I don't think I'm the only one that's saying that, but if you wanted to write down a prescription for a society that would destroy people's soul and take them away from being authentic and self-realized, this is the society, our Western society that we have now, is what you will end up with. Our society could not be more soul-destroying. It could not be a product of a worse social situation for us as spiritual people in almost every aspect of it, right? And so in the end, you become very radical by being an authentic person and living a spiritual life. You become very alternative, radically alternative, and then that creates its own problems, of course, because in Germany, I'll give you an example. In Germany, because of social programming and consumerism and the economy and things like that, okay, there's this idea that people have that you have to replace your roof every 30 years. It's like this sort of unwritten law. And where I lived in a little village in Germany, okay, we just lived, it was a reasonably sort of normal suburban situation, as you'd know in New Zealand. Okay, in other words, sort of quarter acre sections, almost, not quite, but a bit smaller actually in that particular. But anyway, we could sort of see, I don't know, from our house, maybe 20 houses. And in the 7 or 8 years that we were in that house, right, half a dozen of our neighbors that we could see, like literally a stone's throw away, replaced a perfectly fine roof. They had absolutely nothing wrong with it at all. Spent 40 or 50,000 euros to get a new one, which is about, I don't know, 80 or 90,000 New Zealand dollars, right, to get a new roof. And half of the new roofs that we saw getting put on were worse, less quality than the ones that were ripped off. And when they ripped them off, they would never recycle it, right? It's almost like another unwritten law that they put the skip outside, the jumbo bin is outside, and they throw each one individually into the jumbo bin to smash it. And then pay for it to go to the tip, to go to the dump, right? Now, that's deeply ingrained in the German culture, right? Now, the first house that we had in Magdersprung was, it had 4 apartments in it. And the tenants that we had living in the 3 of the 4 apartments hated me because I wouldn't put a new roof on, despite the fact that there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. But because they had this idea that every 30 years you've got to replace your roof, I was an idiot because I wasn't going to replace a roof that had nothing wrong with it. Right. And that's the sort of thing that you get once you want to step outside. I mean, Germany's exceptional. It's very extreme in materialism and waste. I mean, you know, in New Zealand, you see, this is another thing in New Zealand, of course, because we're a colony and we still, well, when I was in New Zealand, I think it's, I mean, I'm 62 years old and I would be at the tail end of people that still have some residue of the pioneer spirit in New Zealand, because I watched it myself while I was in New Zealand being systematically destroyed. This pioneer spirit where you're adapting and you're self-sufficient and, you know, recycling things. But in New Zealand, people wouldn't have, you know, a disdain for you. They wouldn't hold you in contempt if you were living in your house while you were renovating it. You know what I mean? In Germany, they do. You see what I mean? But what I'm trying to do is say this is the types of cultural expectations that people have confronted with. And if you step outside those cultural expectations in a place like Germany that's exceptionally homogenous, it's, you know, like the uniformity in Germany was something that I was just shocked. I'm not saying that there's a huge amount of individuality in New Zealand, but in Germany, I mean, it would be fair to say that if you've met one German, you have met 84 million. That's how extreme it is. I mean, and that is a deliberate thing that has been institutionalized over decades, even you could say more than 100 years in Germany, from one regime after another, one dictatorship after another, where it gets to the point in Germany, right, this is the actual reason that my soul took me to Germany to see this, because I would not have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes, right? It's got to the point where they do not need an overt dictatorship anymore in Germany. The Germans are their own dictators. If you step outside the dominant culture in Germany, you are public enemy number 1.
So liberating ourselves from these external influences is a key sort of like process on the path, because the environmental cultural conditions are impacting us at a, you know, at an unconscious level. And I'll keep bringing this up because there's little things slipping into our awareness that can creep up over time and start to normalize behaviors and patterns. And like you said, you know, normalizing illogical behaviors, like, you know, why do this? And you nailed it quite well there when you said, you know, when you start stepping outside of the accepted kind of walk of the local kind of, you know, this is the way we do things, and people will be shocked and horrified that you would even consider doing that.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I'm mindful of the kind of the language that I can use here on YouTube, so I don't necessarily unnecessarily disadvantage myself. But on the flip side, it's also very important to be, you know, what's one of the you know, above the oracle at Delphi, know thyself. I heard another translation of that in a modern sense from a very hard hitting commentator, which is the first rule of occult initiation is stop lying to yourself. And that requires a very, very objective and honest review of your situation, what you're putting yourself into, and what your environment is consistent of. What are the constituent elements that make up the experience you're having? And your environment plays into that, and the culture as well. And over time, I mean, I've noticed it here since what happened those bunch of years ago, how much that has started to inform the way people walk in the world, their decision-making process, and that's going to ultimately shape the pressures that we experience, especially when you become sensitive. Like, as you do spiritual development work, you become much more sensitive, and you start to realize, like when I was numb, things were a lot easier. And it reminds me of that quote from the Matrix movie. Oh, this is too hard. Just put me back in. But it's like, once you step out, you can't go back in. And so you got to start making uncomfortable changes. And like you said, that can include family as well. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle, because, the long game is that you might have a whole different family in your next life. And if they're providing, I kind of see the world as a set of mirrors. Everyone's a mirror in a sense, and there's a value that can be extracted, but doesn't mean you have to start identifying with what you see. See, it's more like it's giving you feedback to give you a contrast, or in a sense to go, oh, wow, okay. What if I'm angry at someone? Am I angry about something myself? Is it something about me that I'm projecting out with? There's all these different ways of sort of assessing things, but you really nailed it, bro.
When you get angry at someone, it could very well be that it's a projection, or not so much necessarily angry, but when you don't like something about someone, that's very often a projection of something within yourself. But the other side of it is that it can also be a hook bringing up a childhood pain that hasn't been healed, hasn't been acknowledged. You might not even know about it. And as Nietzsche said, the people that are bringing us suffering are actually doing us a favor in the end, because what they're doing is, by putting us through the fire, they're helping us. They challenge, like you're always challenging yourself. How could I have handled that better if I got angry at someone for doing something? And I found over the years, because of course, living in Germany for as long as I did, that was just a lot of challenge. And it was something that I took on board as, I'm going to get to the top of this. And I learned very, very powerfully that just taking things in humor is such a good healing process. You know what I mean? Like, instead of getting angry at someone who might make some attack on you about whatever, whether it's about you personally or about something that, like a lady the other day, sort of somehow or other, we got onto the whole thing that's happening in Gaza. And she was a Trump supporter. And I just sort of said something. She was talking about how Trump was going to save the world, and I just sort of said, yeah, but I mean, he's not going to stop the Third World War starting in the Middle East. He told them to finish the job. And this lady, anyway, to get to the point, because I don't want to get too political here, but to get to the point, she said something about, oh, those bloody Palestinians, that fucking Hamas, they should just all be wiped out. Those Muslims, they're a terrible religion. And I just sort of laughed and said, well, you're a good Catholic, aren't you? And I mean, I had to stop, and I didn't have to count to 10, but I certainly had to stop and check myself, because I was going to get angry. And I just sort of thought, no, I'm not gonna sink into that with her, And by doing that, by just sort of laughing and saying, because she'd already said that she was all very happy as being a Catholic, because I previously said to her that I didn't agree with any of the religions. I didn't agree with Christianity as it's being packaged, or Judaism, or Islam, in fact, Buddhism as well. I don't agree with any of the great religions. And as far as I'm concerned, right now is the period where all of those religions are going to be seen for what they are, just ancient relics. All of those religions, you can, work very hard, which, as you know, I've done with the scriptures from Christianity and Judaism, and find some truth in there. But the overall package, if you take all of the New Testament, or if you take all of the Hebrew Bible, right, and you want to live by that, you're not going to find peace of mind, you know, in the whole package. You've got to very intelligently and very clearly, carefully take out the good stuff from the stuff that's been put in later as political accretion, and you've also got to understand how to read it, which people today have zero idea about how to read Hebrew scriptures or Greek scriptures that were written in the middle of a Hebrew culture, like Hellenized Judaism, which the New Testament is Hellenized Judaism, sort of reshaped to fit a particular sect of Judaism in the first century, and it wasn't the only sect. The sort of the writings that sit in the New Testament was not the only sect that came off from Jesus. It's like in the life of Brian, where you've got the gourd and you've got the shoe, you know what I mean, the sandal, and all these different sects came off Jesus, and the ones that ended up forming the sort of the scriptures. I mean, there's actually differences between Matthew and Luke. They were different sects, right? And Mark, right? You understand? And so what you're doing is you're ending up with combining 4 different sects of Christianity, all of which were much later, far removed from the theology of the historical Jesus, and then it all put together to give you a package that has nothing to do with what Jesus was teaching.
All right, hang on. Just if I could just stop you for a sec. So I'll set this up for the audience if I could, and because there's Steve and I we talk in the background prior to obviously the this discussion here live. So we've been talking for a while. And I just haven't found the time to read a series of his texts on this conversation regarding the historical Jesus, because there's obviously a lot of speculation, and you've got different. I mean, I read a book once that there's sort of like Catholicism. If you look at the root meaning of the word Catholic, it means universal. So it's very much like a very tight subscription membership. There's not a lot of room for flexibility in that. And they've got a 1 billion members sort of thing, person membership. And then I read in this book that there was, at the time of the print, there was something like 36,000 different branches of sort of more Protestant based, Christianity that eventuated. And I put it to this, a guy goes to like a church, not Catholic church, but he goes to a church. Here's a guy speak and goes, you know what? I like what he's saying. I like this, this, and this, but that doesn't jibe with me. I'm going to go start up my own church and then give my own interpretation of what I'm reading and what I'm seeing here. And, and so you have these things start to pop up. And I find this in others too, lineages start to break up and fork out, and people start wandering off. And so that's why you've got the same central core text to an extent, but you've got all these different interpretations of it. And it starts, doing this kind of telephone game, or Chinese whispers, as we say back in the game. And of course, and this is one thing that not a lot of people talk about is how words get, the translations get changed over time. Like, there's the denotative original core meaning of the word. And then over time, it's like, oh, that's not really suitable for now. We want to use a synonym that's mostly related to it, but it still infers other things. And I've seen this as well. And so as time passes, some of the core meanings are lost, and they're only as good as their translations as well. And sometimes things are lost in translation. And that's why, like you said, there's ways of reading these sacred texts in their original form, and there's different layers of information that can be gleaned, understanding. There's a moral, there's the literal, there's the moral, there's a kind of a maybe metaphysical principle based kind of conversation, there's a metaphor, and all these types of things. But I mean, you're the man to ask about this. So what I'm saying here to set the audience up for this next branch of the conversation is that the relationship between spiritual alchemy, which is a big part of your work, and also how that sort of overlaps and connects with the this dive into discovering the story of the historical Jesus, or the understanding of the because the New Testament, there's 2 books in the Bible, and there isn't there, mate?
No,
there's one,
how many books? I forget. 27, isn't it? 27.
No, but what I'm saying is there's the first main book, and then there's the second one, and
No,
then they
there's
just
the first group of books. The first group of books, and then the second.
yeah. Sorry, perfect,
Okay.
absolutely. So this guy's the man, right? So he's going to correct me here. I'm coming from the lay, from the street. There's for me, there's the Old Testament, the New Testament, and yes, I'm fully aware of the there's apocryphal texts missing and these types of things too. But
And
essentially, but what happened is you had these two bodies of work, one that came much later, just got put next to it and said, okay, now you've got a thing. So because it's been put together with this other thing, it instantly validates it. And so the church said, right, we're going to slam them together. Here you go. Here's your new set of books or your set of texts. But back to the setup. Tell us about the junction point or the relationship between spiritual alchemy, which is the process, and then also this nature of, or this conversation about the historical Jesus. And you can probably word this better than I can, so please go for it.
That's a huge question. Okay, I'll do as good as I can. Where do I start? I think, first of all, alchemy as we know it, spiritual alchemy in particular, as we know it, sort of started developing around the Hermetic tradition, started to develop around the same time that Jesus was around. And it's very clear that the precedents of alchemy itself can be found, like proto-alchemical symbolism and images can be found in the Hebrew Bible, like the whole idea of the purifying fire, purifying silver as being used as a metaphor for God's work in our lives, can be found in the Hebrew Bible. And in the New Testament, there's also things like, for example, the purifying fire that John the Baptist is attributed to, have referred to, I'm baptizing you with water, and soon to follow will be one who will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. Okay, the idea of the stone is also something that is in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in Isaiah 28:16-17, it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line." In Job chapter 3, verse 14, "You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created." So the idea is that these same images were very apparent in the Hebrew Bible. And I believe that Jesus actually taught in I guess what you would call a proto-alchemical, using proto-alchemical imagery. Okay. So that's sort of the overlap that I'll just read you another.
I've got some images you've sent me too. So if you need me to bring up any images, just let me know.
All right. Okay. So in Malachi chapter 3, verses 2-3, "But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver." Okay, so that, what I just read there from Malachi, that's pretty much the exact sort of metaphorical sort of use of that symbolism of those images that I'm talking about with spiritual alchemy. It wasn't at all as complex as what alchemy became, especially in the medieval period and the Renaissance period. But this is the beginnings of alchemy, and especially when we consider the down-to-earth elements that I talked about before, about going through who we are, what influences we've had on us, what suffering we might have, what our reason for that suffering might be, what we've contributed to our suffering. Those elements, those what you might call sort of just depth psychology elements that people like Erich Fromm or Eric Berne wrote about, Jung wrote about. Those things are very evident. In fact, the center of the teachings attributed to Jesus, when you intelligently look at the Gospels and understand how they were put together and what's been added later and what's likely to be more authentic and coming from an earlier source. Yeah, so I guess that's the overlap between spiritual alchemy as we have it right now in the 20th century, which is how I've been writing about it with people like Nietzsche and Jung, who have actually talked directly about alchemy and psychology together. And what Jesus was teaching, the overlap is in fact quite close.
That is, you know, like, what do they say? As above, so below. You know, how, you know, and then this correspondence as well of how are things related. And if we are taking these lesser parts of ourselves and seeking to elevate them, so, you know, there's many paths up the mountain, and at the core of every religious, you know, I'd like to think there is some genuine methodology and process, relieved of doctrine and dogma, unnecessary. You know, there is process and pathway that has been adorned and burdened by unhelpful kind of adornment and accessorizing and you know, and political cultural control. You know, a lot of these things, a lot of these systems get repurposed. I mean, you know, the Roman Empire was kind of on the wane. And it's like, man, we need a new shtick. All right, let's go from the Roman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire, you know, and we've got a package here. There's a guy from about 300 years ago. Hey, we could totally like hijack this, you know. I mean, I'm talking very, very casually about this, but I mean, you know, when you're wanting to form a society and when the large majority of the populace are illiterate, you need to strike while the iron's hot. You know, it's very hard to get away with certain things when you've got a society that has a level of, you know, they're able to, you know, interact with the sacred texts in a different way. And so you kind of have to move with the times and keep on the, you know, keep on your feet, you know, when you're trying to run a society and keep a worldview, because, you know, if these teachings are indeed about empowering people and helping them find their true, authentic self, well, an empowered person who is walking with their true light, very hard to control, because
of course I mean, why do you think that the religions in the end have that exoteric and esoteric level to them? Both levels exist in every religion, where the masters are learning the deep mystery religion, you know, the deeper mystery of that religion, and then all of the common people are just given, you know, the scriptures that will keep them in control. And every religion, I mean, of course, I'm a specialist in Christianity and Judaism, but when I was at university, you know, I did papers in the other religions as well, just one or two papers in Buddhism and Hinduism. Okay. And, you know, the academics were writing doctorates and theses on, you know, the same type of accretion added to Buddhism to keep women in their place, for example, you know, and how the same thing happened for these other religions, you know, and it's the same story. If you want, we could probably talk about a way of being able to read the New Testament in particular, or the Gospels in particular, to be able to work out what was the earliest strands of the Gospels and how they developed and changed. And by being able to do that, we can actually see different varying trajectories of the early church, just like in Life of Brian, where one goes off with the sandal and one goes off with the gourd. In fact, funnily enough, when I did honors, before we get on to that, I was going to get you to show that little diagram that I had. so that I
Yep.
could explain about Q. Okay, but just before, when I was doing my honours year in 2007 at university, we had this politically appointed lecturer there who had been paid by the Bible College in New Zealand. So he was a fundamentalist Christian teaching at a religious studies department, which is unheard of. Someone who believed that the entire Bible is the infallible word of God was teaching at a religious studies department. And there were people who had got to honours level. I'd gone away for 10 years from the university and came back. And I was just shocked. And this guy had been there for a few years. And somehow or other, we had people doing honours, right? This is the 4th year full time, right? It's sort of the first half of an MA, okay? People doing honours who really believed that the Bible was the infallible word of God. The entire Bible had to be taken literally, and it was the infallible word of God. I mean, I just was shocked. I couldn't believe it. And anyway, I said to him, or I said to the group one day, that great documentary, that great historical documentary of the beginnings of Christianity, The Life of Brian, I said it as a bit of a joke, and this was in 2007. And he hated it. He hated me saying that, And funnily enough, in 2010, a book was written by a group of academics that went through the life of Brian. There were about 12 academics, and each one of them wrote a chapter about the life of Brian, showing that the life of Brian was actually using cutting edge knowledge of religious studies and was incredibly accurate about how it had portrayed the beginnings of Christianity, including that particular point. The point I was making was that the only thing that was wrong, which never got mentioned in that book, but the only thing that was wrong was there were too many Romans there, because the Romans would be using always use the neighbors as their policemen, like the Samaritans were being used to control Judea rather than Roman soldiers. You see, they would have been, but they might have been in Roman uniforms. So, I just thought of that now. They may actually have been in Roman uniforms, but they would have been Samaritans, the policemen that were in Judea at the time, But apart from that, the life of Brian is actually a documentary about Jesus, including the bit where you get the people at the back and he's saying, blessed is the Greek. What are you talking about? Blessed is the Greek. And then they're arguing over what Jesus had said. And all of a sudden someone goes, oh, it's the meek. Blessed is the meek. And there's a chapter about how people misheard or by Chinese whispers that it got changed and things like that, And of course, the thing with the sandal and the gourd and things is very clear. It's actually an incredibly accurate portrayal of the beginnings of Christianity.
I actually it's like when you go to when somebody showed me some different ways of looking at a painting, I sort of was looking at it and then I stepped back and I tilted my head a little bit. It's like, I'm seeing from different angles now. And then I sort of walked off to the side and I was like, I'm sort of seeing things from different sides here. And, being shown how to see information. And I think, when you're dealing with sacred texts, you get this sacred mode, but then there's also this kind of like the Monty Python version, which is like a kind of a metaphorical, symbolistic kind of comedic version of a similar kind of teaching. And you come at it from you've comedy and humor kind of cracks the rigidity a bit so that you're a bit more relaxed and so that you can have a different relationship with what you're experiencing. And I sometimes wonder if these artists, when they're making things, they're going to have, I have no doubt that these men were very, very intelligent, but I sometimes wonder too that, the medium that they're working with, there's divine expression going, oh, I see an opportunity here. I'm just gonna inspire, put a little bit of maybe unconscious inspiration into this creative process. And, and then you get these masterful pieces. But that's really interesting. Like I haven't actually watched Life of Brian
Yeah,
for a
no,
while.
I like that point about humor. I just want to continue with that because that's a good point. And with people like, or groups like the Monty Python, to be able to laugh is a really, like I was talking about that example where that woman was attacking me with her racism, and I just sort of said, "You're a good Christian, aren't you? You're a good Catholic, aren't you?"
Yeah, I'll put it in perspective.
And I mean, it's like I read somewhere not long ago that it's sort of like creation is a joke, and we need to learn how to laugh, and laughing is such a healing thing, and to be
Really is.
able to laugh in the middle of suffering, And again, I just wanted to mention another thing, that whole at the end when Brian gets crucified and that death squad arrives in black uniforms with the Welsh accents, and then commit suicide. That'll show them. I mean, that's actually a spoof, a satire of the Masada incident, where the Jewish nationalists actually ended up committing suicide, and the Roman Jewish war that lasted from 68 to 73. And it's a very famous event, Masada. There was something like 800 or 900 women and children and rebels, men, warriors, that committed suicide rather than get captured by the Romans at Masada. And that's what that was showing, And they made a joke out of it, which might be kind of a bit blasphemous or not even but disrespectful to the actual depth of the situation. But in the end, satire does that, Satire creates a joke out of our lives, because life is suffering, man. The Buddhists were correct about that, but I don't think the answer is to disconnect yourself from life, or what is it, detachment. I don't buy that at all. I think that's counterproductive. I think we need to attach to it and suffer. I think that the idea of experiencing suffering is a very essential part of being human, and in fact being a living creature, and there is an evolution that comes from that, right? And then when you have actually got to the other side of your suffering and can laugh at your suffering about what a fool I was to do that, that's part of the whole alchemical process. Anyway, do you want to?
I'll bring it up. Yeah, I just want to say that
Go on.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot, like this is the world could be considered to be a big gym, and there's lots of weights that can be lifted, and sometimes you have those weights imposed on you. And I think there's also there's forces at work to dissuade people from becoming stagnant. And so uncomfortable situations help to jostle you out of any kind of weaponized comfort that you may have unwittingly taken on.
Exactly.
And so when you're feeling discomfort, it's kind of helped to dislodge you out of a place where there's no growth happening, because there's a natural want towards evolution and growth, in my view. And there's decay process as well. Like, there has to be a bit of things have to break down a bit before they can be rebuilt. That's our phoenix. Like we have these models of understanding, but I think it's the attitude, and I've heard great attitude, like sort of ideas behind like how you set this up for yourself. And if life's a quest and an adventure, then it changes your attitude towards the challenge that's in front of you. You go, oh, wow, okay, how can I harvest some real value out of this? And just to lead into the next thing, because
hang on, before we do,
sorry,
I just wanted to add to that, because the image of the pearl of great price, that's a very alchemical image as well, because a pearl is created from irritation. Irritation in the oyster. And it probably, I mean, I don't know how much sentience an oyster has, but it would certainly have some sort of pain. It would certainly feel some sort of pain. And it's the pearl of great price, you understand? Yeah. And that's a very alchemical image, which is, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, So, yeah, and that ties exactly into your idea of that. To be in an uncomfortable situation will spur you forward to do something greater. And that also comes back to the example I used earlier about the person who's working 9 to 5 in an office, making a boss rich and earning You know, to sit in that for 40 years, which is the norm. I mean, when I was a child, like I'm 62 years old, my parents' generation could not understand anything apart from that you find a career and you do 9 to 5 for 40 years and then retire, or 50 years and then retire. That was it. That was like, that's what you do, you know?
Yeah.
And then my generation, which I'm at the tail end of the baby boom, were the first ones to start questioning that and protesting, you know, like the counterculture of the 60s and 70s and things like that, you know, that we're actually starting to question the values of our society, the expectations and norms of what it means to live in this culture, you know. And of course,
Yeah.
now that we're at the very end, you know, we're watching live stream the death of the Western modern industrial social experiment, you know. I mean, in 5 years it's over. The West is gone. 10 at the most. Between 5 and 10 years will be the full collapse. You don't see that.
Well, I can see that we're in a sorry.
I'm just being provocative.
I know, but it's pretty hard to deny that we're in some state of transition, and it's looking a little dire. You know, like you know, people are basically being pitted against each other. If it's not this, you know, there's so many ways to divide the family unit. You know, you've got arguments that can be drawn from your views on red versus blue, this is that, but without getting too caught up in that. The idea is, guys, is that once you find that bedrock of certainty based on, you know, you start having experiences and you go, there's something to this. And you go, I know there's a spiritual reality because I'm having experiences that point towards that, or I'm getting pretty sure there's something going on here. That there suddenly starts to make everything else that you've been presented with by society start to show some cracks in it. And there's a deeper reality that's not put forward so much, that's not celebrated by on the television and things like that. And like you said, you know, if you're in a job, at some point, you're just going to have enough. If it doesn't drive you nuts, and you know, and you show up at the next funny hat day or Taco Tuesday, you know, like with you know, it's just like this really it's just not enough. But now one of you just to move into the next thing, because we've got this great conversation that I can't wait to have, and that is when you look at the first 4 books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John,
the Gospels,
right?
yeah.
Yep, they are. And I know you're going to correct me here because you're the man, but essentially they're kind of telling the same story, but in different ways. And so what we have is that we have the ability, one of the most powerful tools in spiritual development is contrast. And there are some things that one book says that is said in the other book, but it's said in a different way. And it's like, well, why is that? You know, so my question is like, tell us about your adventure, because there's other factors. There's this talk of Q, and people might be like, well, what's this Q? So could you give us, teach us, Steve, teach us about the Gospels and Q and such.
Okay, do you want to put that thing up? And as I'm talking.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Here we go. All right, everyone. Here's a diagram that Steve gave us here.
Okay, so the idea, this is pretty universally accepted. I'd say that 80% of Bible historians and New Testament scholars would accept something similar to this. There's obviously a lot of different nuances that people consider, but this is generally accepted, okay? And I accept it because it makes a lot of sense, all right? So the idea is, you can see here that we have the Gospel of Mark at the top there, okay? And the idea is that Mark was written first, all right? And it was written probably about 70 during the war, or possibly just at the end of the war, the Roman-Jewish war, okay? And then Matthew and Luke both had a copy. Matthew and Luke were written about 15 to 20 years later, okay? And both Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them, all right? And they reproduced Mark into their Gospels, okay? Now, some of the reproduction of Mark in Matthew and Luke is verbatim. It's word for word. And so, therefore, we know that they've copied Mark, okay? That makes full sense. But there are many aspects or many verses, many stories that we have the original in Mark that Matthew and Luke edit. Okay. And sometimes that editing is very significant. Very significant. Okay. And so we know that Matthew and Luke went off in two opposing trajectories. In other words, Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke represents two different, actually quite dramatically opposing views of who Jesus was. Okay. And we probably don't have time tonight. We can actually do a second part of this because it's taken us a while to get this far. But I can give you some graphic examples of stories that Mark wrote that Matthew and Luke use and edit Mark's stories in opposite directions to tell an opposite story. Okay. And the idea is that instead of reading Matthew and then Mark and then Luke and then John vertically, the idea is to understand really the stories, okay, is that you read them horizontally. So instead of reading the whole book of Mark, then the whole book of Matthew, and then the whole book of Luke, okay, what you do is you read one particular story in Mark, and then you find that same story in Matthew, and you put them together side by side, and then you get Luke's version, and you read all three versions of them. Okay, if you read the Passion narrative, for example, there's all three of the Gospels, those three Gospels. They're called the Synoptic Gospels. John's put it at the side there because the Gospel of John is not considered to have been connected to these other three. So in other words, the Gospel of John is an independent attestation. The letters M and L that are in brackets and pointing to the books of Matthew and Luke, that's further hypothesized sources that they had where they had other sources coming into their own that they used in their own Gospels. But anyway, the point is that 90% of Mark is rewritten in Matthew and Luke. And both Matthew and Luke are both twice the size of Mark. Okay, so in other words, about half of Matthew and half of Luke is their version of Mark. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Right, okay. Now, of the other half of Matthew and Luke, half of that, in other words, a quarter of Matthew and a quarter of Luke, is also the same. Okay, do you understand? And so it seems pretty natural that that other piece of shared narrative that Matthew and Luke have, that's the same, they had something else in front of them that they copied. And so the Gospel of Q was hypothesized to be that shared source. Q is actually from the German word for source, which is Quelle. Okay. And Q, obviously, we know what Matthew and Luke agree with outside of their agreement with Mark. So we can write down all the things that Matthew and Luke have in common that they haven't copied from Mark. We write that down, and so we have a good idea of, well, we have Q. We write that down, and then we get Q. Okay, and then Matthew and Luke also have their own unique independent stories, which is where the M and where the L comes from. Do you understand that? And by doing that, you really see that this is a rational way of understanding. And the main point here is that Q has very little in the way of storyline. Q is just pithy sayings, and the Sermon of the Mount is in Q, and Jesus said this and Jesus said that. There's not much in the way of actual story narrative. It's just like the one-liners. It's very primitive. And so because it's that form, scholars have always assumed that Q is very early, probably about as early as the writings of the letters of Paul, which is about 50. In other words, where Matthew and Luke agree outside of their borrowing from Mark, that's the earliest level or strand of the Gospels. All right. And that's called Q. And that's very interesting when you look at Q and you see what is, because in that sense, if you accept that, which is completely logical, it makes total sense. Another thing is that when they found the Nag Hammadi collection of so-called Gnostic scrolls, they found the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas came back to us. We knew about the Gospel of Thomas because there's references to the Gospel of Thomas in some of the church fathers, and they were, of course, anti the Gospel of Thomas because it was heterodox or heretical. It was outside what became the canonized version of Christianity, if you like, in the 4th century with Constantine. And it's assumed that this cache that was found in Nag Hammadi was actually hidden away about that time when these books would have become banned. The Gospel of Thomas. There were quite a few different Gnostic codices, okay, that were found. But anyway, the Gospel of Thomas has also, now that we've found it, now that it's being translated and we see it, okay, and we have a full extant version of it. There's the second verse of it is missing, but apart from that, the whole thing is there. So we've got a very good, clean copy, you know, and it looks very much like what we always expected Q would look like, just sort of pithy sayings. And even more interesting than that is that a third of the Gospel of Thomas overlaps with the Gospel of Q, which also shows that there was some overlap in the early church, right? Because we can imagine that Q, if the Q that we have, or sorry, the Q that Matthew and Luke had, right, in sort of 80 to 90, between 80 and 90 CE, right, the Q that Matthew and Luke had at that point, okay, that had evolved over a period of time. And so we could probably say that Q had earlier strands that might have only been one page. And then after another 5 years, another page was added to it. It might even have started within 10 years of Jesus' death. And that's not being silly. That's not, you know, people just sort of, after Jesus died, they just sort of said, hey, man, you know what? We should start writing this down. What he said. And there would have been people 10 years later that would have said, you remember that time he said, blessed are the meek, you know? Yeah, we'll write. He definitely, I remember him saying that. We'll write that down. And slowly, bit by bit, they would have accumulated different bits, you know, one page here, someone wrote it down. And despite, contrary to the opinion of most modern academics, that would not have been out of their reach. You know, even though Jesus' followers probably were, as attributed to him, the poor people, the ability to read and write was nowhere near as scarce in those days as what the mainstream academics have tried to paint it. And in the last 30 or 40 years in particular, we found a lot of evidence to show that, in fact, there was a lot of teaching and literacy in Judaism, you know. So the idea that someone could have found someone to be a scribe and write a few sentences from the Jesus that they actually met 10 years after Jesus had died, that's not being unreasonable at all. In fact, it's being unreasonable to think that that is not the way that Q developed and then Q evolved into, you know, because we don't have an extant version of Q, because Q became redundant when Matthew and when Luke wrote Q into their Gospels. There was no more need for Q anymore, whereas the Gospel of Thomas, which continued growing, okay, wasn't written into another gospel. And so the Gospel of Thomas remained as it was, an early source, not necessarily the most authentic source, and not necessarily as old as what we can imagine Q would have been. Okay, certainly earlier strands of the Gospel of Thomas and earlier strands of Q can be assumed to be early. Okay, but I mean, you know, some parts of it, and then later, like there's certainly, I don't think any academic would disagree that the end of the Gospel of Thomas, that's very sort of woman will not enter into the kingdom of heaven, very sexist and very male patriarchal. Most scholars will accept, and it's very logical, rational to accept that that was added later. That's something that was added to the Gospel of Thomas later. Okay, so I mean, do you understand what I put forward? Because it's, I think I haven't ever explained it verbally. I've only ever written about it, and so I'm not 100% sure if I've explained the situation of Q. But I just want to end by saying that the Q gospel is where I am looking now specifically and unpacking the Q. And in Q, there is a lot of the scripture. I have not come to bring peace but a sword, because son will turn against father, and mother will turn daughter will turn against mother. And the scripture of, if you cannot hate your brother, and if you cannot hate your father and mother for my name, you are not worthy of me. And they are very, very alchemical scriptures when you consider the process of gaining autonomy and independence from the dictates and expectations from our culture. That is exactly what those scriptures are pointing to. And that's all at Q. It comes from Q.
Well, I'm sure this is, going to prompt some exploration ventures for people who hear this, because I'm sure that this will be the first time some people will have heard this information, and so I'm grateful for that, brother. Thank you for that. And you've certainly enlightened a new sort of angle of how to view the information and how it can come about, because you're right. Comparative analysis is how we can find underlying commonality and shared principle based understandings. You said you're comparing like the same story in this and this and this, and the lens it was, what colored that lens that created that, that version of it. But what I was going to say, Steve, is that we're coming up towards the 90-minute mark here, and we definitely want to give you a plug. But I've got a question from the audience here I'd love to throw up.
Absolutely.
So Will is asking, was Jesus just a personification of the Son, i.e., God's Son? He dies on the cross, the Southern Cross. So he's talking about astrotheology here, and is reborn in 3 days, winter solstice, or his halo is depicted like the sun's rays beam. So would you like to chime in on this, please?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. I was actually going to mention Eusebius before, when we were talking about Constantine and the process through the 4th century of Christianity slowly becoming the official religion by the end of the 4th century, of the Roman Empire. Very interesting point that in Q, by the way, there's nothing to do with that Jesus is God incarnate. Okay. There's nothing to do with the crucifixion, although we know that the crucifixion happened. There's nothing to do with the resurrection. And in fact, only the Gospel of Luke, of all 4 Gospels, only the Gospel of Luke mentions the ascension at all. Okay, if you want to read the passion narratives in all 4 of the Gospels, it's a very interesting thing to do. Because they're all different. They're all very, very different. And I think we can do another show, and I'll go through how they are different and why they are different, and what they say about the different Jesuses of Matthew and Luke and Mark and John. Because if you've got to remember that in the 1st century, when these books were written, okay, John was the latest, and it was probably written between 90 and 100. Okay, and by John, right, it was very firmly established that Jesus was God. The idea of God's Son, as in, the Father and the Son, right? There's nothing unique about that. That's, if Jesus said, I'm the Son of God, that wouldn't have raised hackles for the Jewish leaders in the first century. If Jesus said, I'm the Son of Man, that wouldn't have either. Even the term Messiah, that would have been a bit controversial, but that's not a unique term. These things were used in the Hebrew Bible. The whole idea of the Messiah, that just means the anointed one. That's what the Messiah means. That's what the word means. Okay. I know that the Jews had the idea that the Messiah would come and, reinstate the land of Israel and at the end of time and things like that. And the Jews are still waiting for that. That's part of the problem with all these eschatological, Ben Gevira and all of that on the West Bank, these people, he's got his own army now, and that's because they're waiting for the Messiah to come. All right. But what you're talking about here with the Son, as in the Sun God, Eusebius in the 4th century, who was the speechwriter for Constantine. You should read his stuff because it's beautiful, really poetic, and really takes on all of these pagan images very powerfully and puts them into Christianity for Constantine, and I have no doubts whatsoever that Constantine was a sun worshipper, but the strand of the first church, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can say that there was a Q community, a Mark community, a Matthew community, a Luke community, a Thomas community. One's got the sand, one's got the gourd. Okay, you know what I mean? And they all had their different idea of who Jesus was. The John community was the one that saw, the only one, right, from these anyway in the canon, that saw that Jesus was actually God. Okay. The only one, the latest one. And Thomas also. Like the Gospel of Thomas has a good attestation of its early pedigree, because the doubting Thomas only appears in John, and that is an obvious polemic against the Thomas community. Okay. And the Thomas community also saw Jesus as something like God. There's no crucifixion and resurrection in Thomas either, but there's a very much a sort of a non-dualist Gnostic idea of Jesus in Thomas, which is also universalized in Thomas for everyone. Okay. But these images of that Jesus rose 3 days later, and it was at that point, that Christmas came, that started happening as Christianity moved its way into the pagan world. The first Christians who followed Jesus, even the John community, but certainly the synoptic communities, if you want to, for want of a better term, and Q community, they were not seeing it like that. That came later, when the myth of Christianity, the myth of the resurrection and all of that started meeting the Hellenistic world and started being shaped for the Hellenistic audience. Matthew is probably the one, the Magi in Matthew, okay, is a very overlooked, very significant thing. The Magi only appear in Matthew, and we all know that the Magi were the Magius, which is the Persian diviners. They were priests and they were diviners and astrologers, and effectively, the word is the root of our English word magician. Okay, and that's very pagan friendly. The Magi, right, don't go to the stable. Okay, if you read the birth narrative in Matthew, okay, you will see that the Magi go to Joseph's house in Bethlehem. Okay.
Interesting.
In Matthew, Jesus wasn't born in a stable. In Matthew, the Magi, right, follow the star to Joseph's house. He had a house. It says it clearly in the 2nd chapter of Matthew. And they go to Joseph's house. And on the way to Joseph's house, they meet Herod the Great and talk to him and say, "We come to see the Messiah." And then by the time they get to Joseph's house in Bethlehem, they realize, oh, we've told Herod that there's a Messiah, and he's not going to be very happy about that. Okay. And so they warn Joseph, and Mary and Joseph and Jesus go to Egypt. Okay, which is a nod towards magic. All right, I'm telling you this story because it fits into the question of the Hellenization. Matthew is the Hellenized gospel. All right, so that's, although it does repeat the Exodus story of Moses, right? That Jesus and his family go to Egypt to escape Herod, right? Okay. In the context of the Magi, the magicians, if you like, okay, it's giving a nod to Egypt because Egypt was well known then as the center of magic. Okay. So it's connecting again because, of course, if the Magi are bowing down and he's the king of the magicians for Jesus, do you understand? And then he goes to Egypt. And then later in the 2nd century, when all of Celsus and the Jewish leaders were writing in the Talmud about how Jesus was a failed disciple and a magician, and all these are the polemics against Jesus, you know, that he was a sort of a charlatan, you know, a charlatan magician. That's what the Jewish people were saying by the 2nd century. And they all said he went to Egypt and learnt magic, but he was a failed disciple. You see what I mean? So the idea about that, I know all about this astrotheology, and of course it does make sense. We all know that the Virgo, the Venus, and the 3 days, and the death of the sun, and the winter solstice, and all of that, and then the rising again, and of course you've got Easter, which is, you know, at the equinox, and all of these astrotheological symbols, that these all got added on later slowly over a long period of time. Okay, that Jesus was the Son, you know, that was very well articulated in the 4th century by Eusebius, and I really recommend that people will read Eusebius's speeches that he wrote for Constantine, you know, because, and it also shows very clearly, if you know to read it in that sense, that there was the greater and lesser mystery. Okay, so they had the lesser mystery for the masses, and then the greater mystery for those that were in the inside, you know, that knew about the secrets, you know. I just want to finish. I want to get back to this thing about the different birth narratives, because this idea that the wise men, the Magi, came with their 3 gifts to the stable is finger jointing 2 conflicting narratives together, because there's no stable in Matthew's story. Okay, so that's how it happens. The Magi go to Joseph's house. They warn him about Herod. Joseph takes Jesus and Mary to Egypt. All right. Excuse me. And then after a period of time, okay, Herod dies. He died 4 BCE, right? 4 BC. Okay, that's when Herod died. Okay, that's important to remember. Okay, and then when they come back, they're afraid of Herod Antipas, Herod's son, and so they decide that they will go and live in Nazareth, okay, in the Galilee, so that they're not being threatened by Herod's son and Antipas. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you what happens in Luke. In Luke, Joseph lives in Galilee already. right? And they have to go for the census to Bethlehem because that's the line of David, and they have to go because of the census to where their heritage was. Okay, and there was no room at the inn, which we all know, and so they had to sleep in a stable. Okay, now we know there was a census, and the census happened 7 CE, 7 AD. Okay, which is, what's that? 7 and 4, 11 years after Herod the Great died. You understand? In Matthew, Herod the Great was around and he died 4 BC. In Luke, there's a census that happened 11 years later. And that's what caused them to go from the Galilee where they already were to Bethlehem because of the line of David. But guess what? We also know from Josephus, who we know when the census was, 7 AD or CE, right? And we also know the very obvious logical fact that the people did not move around for the census, because the reason the census was taken, right, was because they wanted to tax people on the lands they were presently occupying. So the census taker moved around. I mean, what a logistical nightmare that everyone had to move around to the land of their ancestors. It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous, right? The census taker moved to where they were living then, right? So that they could say, oh, you're occupying this much land, you've got this much cattle or goats or whatever, and you're making this much money, and therefore you're going to pay us this much tax. Okay, and there are no wise men at all mentioned in Luke's gospel, right? There are magi mentioned by Luke in the book of Acts, which probably was written by Luke, and that's Elymas, okay, and he's naughty, right? And they actually kill him. In other words, the word magos in Luke is an insult. In Matthew, it's venerated. In Luke, they're baddies. Okay. So they went in completely different political trajectories. Okay. Matthew's gospel is pro-Roman, pro-magic, and very much more strongly anti-Jew. Whereas Luke's gospel is much more compared to Mark, right? Much more anti-Roman and pro-Jew. Okay. The reason I've already mentioned that with the Magi and the go to Egypt, that's all about paganism and magic and Hellenistic ideas. Okay. The reason that Luke mentions the census, and I'll say this just because the reason that both of these birth narratives were invented, okay, is a very strong. This actually annoys the conservative Christians who think this is the word of God, because these two very conflicting birth narratives, okay, they actually are very powerful attestations, not only that Jesus lived, but in fact that we have some detail of him, that he did in fact live in Nazareth. Because what they are both doing in very different ways is trying to explain how it was that the Messiah is born in Bethlehem, and yet the oral tradition, the established original tradition of who Jesus was, must have been firmly acknowledging that Jesus lived and taught in the Galilee. And that's the reason both of those birth narratives were added to the Gospels. Does that all make sense?
Well, for myself, I'm getting new dots and connectors to dots being presented to me here. And so, I'm a processor. I'll have to sit with it. But, as far as the elucidation of the information goes, brother, you've done a great job there, because, I think one of the things, that's alive very well and true in various of what we might refer to as the online spiritual communities is there's a lot of conjecture and speculation based on pretty flimsy or even channeled, if you want to call it that, information. and there's a lot of sort of artistic kind of extrapolation that happens. And so, you know, you bring in some pretty robust and rigorous kind of research. It's the kind of language I prefer, to be honest, because you know, if I can verify it, you're giving me threads that I can follow to discern for myself, which I am very grateful for. So, and I just want to.
Sorry, yep. Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to complete something about Luke when I was talking about the political trajectories, because I haven't established about Luke being pro-Jewish. Don't forget that Luke almost certainly wrote the book of Acts, and in the book of Acts, the first church in Jerusalem is described and extolled. They're the ones that hated the Magi or the Elamists. They used the word Magi. You're welcome, Will. They use the word Magi as a sorcerer. It becomes translated. Funnily enough, the same word, right? Magi or magus, it is, right? In Matthew, it becomes wise men, right? That's what it's translated in English. In Acts, that word magus is sorcerer, elamos, right? Anyway, the reason that the census is mentioned in Luke is because that was a period of great political rebellion, Jewish nationalism, and that's why the census happened. And they're putting Jesus in with the Jewish rebels because the Jewish rebels were, I wouldn't say inconvenience is not strong enough, and attacked is a little bit too hard, but somewhere in the middle of that. The census was like an oppression over them to tax them, right? The rebels, okay? And they put Jesus, connected him to the rebels there, all right? By making his birth, he was inconvenienced by the census, just like the rebels were inconvenienced, okay? And I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg of the pro-Jewish nationalism that appears in Luke, but because it's in the birth narrative, it sets the scene. You understand? Because, of course, the book of Luke was written for the Jewish nationalists who were the church at Jerusalem. So that's the Lucan community. We have a very good idea who the Lucan community were because they're described in the book of Acts as the Jerusalem church. These are the followers of Jesus who set up soon afterwards, who all hijacked. They're the ones really that hijacked Jesus' name, okay? And they're the ones where Jesus became the Messiah, okay? It's really only in Luke where Jesus becomes the Messiah in the Jewish sense of the Messiah, okay? Matthew's Jesus is different, Mark's Jesus is different, and John's Jesus is different, okay? Now, I just want to make one more little sort of example here, illustration here of how the Gospel of Mark, the narratives in Mark have been changed. Okay, now at the cross, Jesus is crucified with two rebels, and that the word in Greek is lestos, and they were Jewish nationalists who were going around robbing people like land pirates, like highwaymen, you know. And in Mark, it's very clear that Jesus is being distanced from them because they both mock him to the end. And it specifically says in Mark that both the rebels, the lestos, the Jewish nationalists, militant nationalists, right, they mock Jesus to the end. And Matthew repeats that. Matthew is faithful to that. In Luke, however, one of them repents and says, I know you, you're the Son of God. And Jesus said, you have great faith. You're going to sit with me next to the Father this evening, right? And by doing that again, Luke is placing Jesus, connecting Jesus with the Jewish nationalists, the militant Jewish nationalists. And a lot of the sort of these, what you were talking about, Phil, about these flowery new age, you know, taking some little thing and from, you know, the 4th or 5th or maybe 3rd century, you know, some writing, and then trying to say that Jesus sort of came down from the cross and had children with Mary Magdalene and all this sort of stuff, or wandered around Tibet and stuff like that, which there is zero evidence for all of these things. Okay. No.
You're talking about the Nicholas Notovich book, the
I don't know. I'd rather not mention any specific.
Fine. Carry on.
They became quite popular at the end of the 19th century. All these channeled the gospel, the Aquarian gospel, and all of this sort of thing, and there's just all cannot be. No serious scholar of this Bible history would take any of that serious. But but anyway, that's what Luke did. Luke connected Jesus to the Jewish nationalists, the militant nationalists. And in Mark, when Jesus is arrested, the word lestos is used again. And Jesus by Mark, Jesus is distanced from the rebels, because Jesus says, what, you think I'm a rebel that you come with your clubs and swords to arrest me? Okay. In other words, by saying that, by putting it in those terms, then Mark is distancing Jesus from the rebels. And now I've just touched on another point I'm going to have to clarify, is that we do know, very controversial thing here, is that some of Jesus' followers were armed up in the temple, which is just having arms in a weapon in the temple is high treason, sedition. And it really does seem, because it's so controversial, it wouldn't have ended up in the Gospel of Mark unless there was some powerful oral tradition that some sort of physical violence took place. And it says that, the one of the priest's servant's ear, the ear of a priest's servant was chopped off. And all four Gospels attest to that. So that's a pretty strong attestation. And the point is that the group of guards that was sent to arrest Jesus, was not a legion. I can't remember the word now, but it was 500 anyway. The number equates to 500 soldiers were sent to arrest Jesus. In other words, there are a lot of clues in there that some of his followers were, in fact, Jewish nationalists. And certainly the church that's described in the book of Acts, which is written by Luke, right? The church they were absolutely Jewish nationalists, and they were very big on Jewish purity laws. In fact, if it wasn't for Paul, they had big fights with Paul, not only about circumcision and food purity laws following the Jewish tradition, right, which Paul was totally against, and which Christianity ended up dumping all of that. But they didn't even want Gentiles to have anything to do with their religion. And that was a big bone of contention that in Acts is smoothed out. But when you read the letters of Paul, where he writes about, especially in Galatians, it wasn't so smooth, the ending of that. And I take Paul's side of the story rather than the glossed over, smoothed over, polished up Acts side where it gets smoothed over, this bone of contention, this big argument, because in the end, Paul has nothing to do with the Jerusalem church. And they were very clearly militant Jewish nationalists. So I've said what I thought was a lot more than I thought I was going to, but I sort of, once you start, it's like you go, that one question sort of ended up, I think that I've answered it pretty comprehensively. I hope I have, because I've given you a really good sort of snapshot into, in the first century, the different views of who Jesus was. But that astrotheology, that came a lot later. The dates of when everything happened, like Jesus was born, in December, and the whole, do you understand, all of those particular things we're sort of, we better make sure that we say Jesus was born on the 25th of December, because we want to fit it into the solstice,
I think that's what happens with a lot of systems, is that they get sort of, they get fused with existing local sort of relatable things. And so, Yeah, but that's a conversation for another time, brother. I'm going to have to stitch it up shortly. I just want to say thanks to everyone who's been hanging out in the chat and asking questions and that. And so what we want to do now is that we want to, as you can tell, Steve's demonstrating a great openness and willingness to share deep context and his depth of knowledge and experience. And it's been a long amount of time he spent on this. And he studied this in an academic sense quite deeply at institution level as well. And so, if you're into this kind of topical material, you really can't look past this gentleman's sort of body of work, of which there is a lot, which now we're going to have a quick look at on his amazing Etsy site. So here's his Etsy here, and you can see that it's called Free Spirit Books, and the link is in the description below. So actually, I'll put this one up here. And so this is the best place to come and purchase your books once, so you can come in and discover you've got a couple of books here, Steve. Are there any that you'd like to particularly highlight? Because, I mean, there's so much going on here.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I mean, you can see here at the top, right? Those are the ones that I feature. So Jesus in the Ancient Mysteries, that's showing a lot of the Hellenistic mystery religions. Okay, I mean, there's absolutely that Jesus, the whole teachings of Jesus. Like, people think that Jesus had something to do with the Essenes, and we haven't got time here for me to explain this, and I'm quite happy to come back and do that, but that's just impossible, and you can prove that that's impossible. In fact, what with John the Baptist and with Jesus, especially the way that Paul has taken it, but also the teachings directly from Jesus, okay, we can see very clearly, in fact, that Jesus was teaching something very close to the Hellenistic mystery religions. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, once you start, you can't stop. So I just
that's
what goes into it. That's Gnosis, right? This second one, Spiritual Alchemy, the Self Initiation, that's my manual, which gives a really good overview into spiritual alchemy. Early Christian Magic, that's a very good book teaching about, giving you really good examples, and a collection of academic journals that show different examples, archaeological and textual examples of Christian magic from the very beginnings. And then I wrote my own book on Christian magic using a mixture of the Hellenistic knowledge that's in the New Testament, which there is, in fact, a lot. Once you need to understand Greek to be able to understand that they're actually smuggling a whole lot of magical mystery religion concepts into Christianity, which are completely lost in translation. In English, you don't know at all what the Greek texts are saying, the Gospels and the writings of Paul in particular. There's just no idea what's going on in English. It's very, very mystical, magical stuff, and that's again something that it'll just take too long for me to explain it, but once you understand Greek, you understand Christianity is full of magic. I'll give you one example. Okay. Oh no, I won't. Sorry, no, we're running.
We've got better keep moving, bro. But as you can see, guys, the brother is wanting to share and to share understanding that you can. I think too that critical-minded people want satisfying information, and generally speaking, a lot of what we're provided with is just here's the thing, just read this and believe it. Take it as being what it is, and it's like. It's not good enough for a lot of us, especially those who are, like hermeticists and scientists of these spiritual, sacred sort of methodologies and postulations. So, Steve really fleshes it out. If you get one of his books, you'll be buying more. So buy a bunch. But on the other side of it too, you have, hang on, no, not that one. Where are we here?
Why don't you go to that I sent you that medieval. Oh, okay. There's the Goodreads, right?
Okay. So Goodreads is where you can go to get other people's takes on your book. Like you can get reviews and you can see comments and you can see that there's a community forming. Steve also does question and answering on here as well about the material. So it's probably a bit more interactive than, say, Etsy, which is more like the shop. Whereas this is where you can come to get, this is where you can, like, this is probably more of a community focus, I guess. Goodreads is there. Remember, all of these are in the YouTube description below, guys. Now, of course, Steve also has a YouTube channel, which he has a stack of videos on, and that is it's under Free Spirit Books or at the Enchanted Garden, and that's also in the description below. So you can check in here, and he has got there's about 30, 40, close to 40 videos. You can hear him speak on various topics, and then of course we have the Patreon, and so. What's the purpose of the Patreon, Steve?
Okay, the Patreon is like a blog, basically, and if you want to, you can support me. But there are many free posts. At the moment, I've started doing some posts on politics. In fact, there, Israel. No, go back. Israel and the US. Who is the dog and who is the tail? There's a bit of a debate at the moment in the geopolitical discussions about whether Netanyahu is actually dragging America into a third world war, or whether in fact the US is quite happy to do it and is just pretending that it doesn't want to. And here we go here. This is Jesus of Q beside the mysteries, Jesus of Q beside the mysteries, the Jesus of Q. This is all the book I'm doing at the moment, which has only got one chapter to go. It's all being published here already on Patreon. And it's, I tell you what, before I understood, I became involved in the sort of spiritual dynamics of the life, sort of got hit by, the whole kind of, well, there's something more than what we see in the world, in the universe, when I was 19. And sort of from about my from then until about my mid to late 20s. And I spent a couple of years, 2 or 3 years in the church at that point as well, in my mid to late 20s. But I read the Bible a lot. I tried to read the Bible, and I struggled with it. And then I went later than most people to university. I didn't go full time until I was 30. And I'm really glad, because I spent a good 10 years or even a little bit longer, just as a normal person going to church. Obviously I was quite intellectual about trying to learn things, but I didn't understand how to read the Bible until I went to university. Okay. And then all of a sudden, as soon as I learned how to be a detective, how to play with the Bible and work out what's earlier, what's later, and also work out, oh yeah, you can see Luke, yeah, that crafty old bugger, the way that he has edited that and changed it for his own audience. And Matthew, wow, he's a pretty cool dude, actually, because he's right into magic, Matthew. This here is a medieval painting of Luke. That's Luke there, who at the beginning of Luke, he even says that he uses earlier sources. Okay, so he's got the book of Mark and Q in front of him as he's writing his own book, his own gospel. Yeah, but yeah, it was very good for me to have a good long period of not understand. That's how most Christians are, like fundamentalist Christians, right? You can say to them, Bible is the word of God, is it? And they'll say, yeah, absolutely, infallible word of God. And you can say, have you read it all? And they'll go, no. Right? And I know so many, obviously, because I was in the church for 3 years or something, and I know a lot of fundamentalist conservative Christians who think the Bible is the word of God. God wrote the Bible, and they haven't even read it. I mean, if I thought God had written a book, I would read it. I would make sure. But they don't know how to read it. They don't know how to read it. I mean, I was the same. I hadn't read all of the Bible. I still haven't read all of the Bible. But of the New Testament and a fair swag of the Old Testament, I have read it over and over and over in depth in English and Greek and Hebrew, and read commentaries on it from Philo and Maimonides, and you know what I mean. And I mean, I never thought I'd say this when I was in my 20s, but it's probably one of the most exciting things that I do in my life.
And with that said, it's like, well, it's this huge puzzle or riddle or something that's got so many ways of approaching. And I think too that when people obviously get, have their education from the modern standard, however we frame that, they're going to read these texts through that skill set they've developed, and so they're going to see it through that, and so they're missing things that have changed over time, as especially since education is so political, and these types of things. And so as far as the meaty true goodness that you can get from these texts go, look, I've got a Bible and I just flick through it, pick a page, and it's amazing, like how appropriate in most cases what you just flick to has to do with what's going on in your life. Guys, this is a great thing to do. That book has been purposely like the joy you can get out of exploring this book, and it's more than just the words you get in the physical analog. It's where it can lead you, and coming across Steve's work can really reinvigorate. I would say that if there's any Christians in the audience right now who are feeling a bit they're feeling like that their church isn't doing it for them, or they're not having explained to them right, there is something worthwhile in this. You know it in your heart. But the teachers that you're looking for are out there, and I believe Steve is going to be that person for a lot of you, because a lot of you want intellectual satisfaction, or you want to feel like somebody's really going deep on this, because there's a lack of depth in society that's being actively harvested, and it's creating a very shallow, superficial version of the world. Essentially, it's swapping out reality for some artificial nonsense. It's a bait and switch, and it's through these studying sacred texts with the eye of the investigator, of the eye of the detective, will help you to see the world in a similar light. So, that diligence in your efforts will result in a higher quality of life, because you will be confronted with realities that are far more interesting and exciting than what's being sort of farmed out there in the meantime. So please. Now, Steve, we'll call it there in a sec, but I'll get you to stick around for a minute after I end the broadcast if I could. But I'd really like you to, if you've got some final words of encouragement, inspiration, or anything for the audience before we sign off, I'll give you the final words.
Oh, well, thanks, Phil. And what you just said actually pretty much summed it up, to be honest. I was actually going to congratulate you on the really articulate way, eloquent way that you express the fact that we're living in a dumbed down world, man. We really are. I mean, I'm a mega conspiracy theorist. I just absolutely know that rich people are controlling what's going on in the world, and they have deliberately they've hijacked the education system. Science is dead mostly. They're not 100%, but it's certainly, and it's like, just think for yourselves, man, and question everything. Especially, I'll tell you what, if it's on the mainstream media, it's almost certainly propaganda and not to be believed. It's getting worse and worse all the time.
Wonderful. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And you're right, always discern what you're absorbing. I just want to say a big thank you to my wonderful guest, Steve Seven. Please go and check out his many, 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 many works and offerings. I'm going to give Steve a bit of a nudge to maybe consider doing some live streaming himself. I just want to put that out there and just put that in the thing. But I don't want to go into that just. But I want to say thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you for everyone watching. And if you're watching this after the fact, I appreciate you guys too. Have a beautiful, wonderful day, everyone. We will no doubt see you all again very soon. Blessings to everyone.
God bless you all. Thanks for watching.
And we'll see you guys soon. Cheers.